O heavenly King, comfort of the Spirit of truth, who art everywhere present, and fillest all things, treasure of blessings, and giver of life, come and abide in us. Cleanse us from every impurity, and save our souls, O good one. Okay. Very good.
Don't we sing Eis Pola Eti Despota?
God bless you.
Okay.
Eis Polaiety.
Eis Pola Eti Despota.
Ah, yes, there you go.
It was an accidental German pronunciation, ice.
Yeah. Well, there's the old story of of the old ladies, old Greek ladies who, the old Russian ladies, the old babushki, who one of them goes on a trip to Russia, to Greece. I'm messing this up. She goes on a trip to Greece, and when she comes back, her friends ask her, "Well, how was it?" And she says, "Oh, it was all in Greek except for Eis Polaiety Despota."
And Kyrie eleison, somehow they slipped that in.
That's right. So, Chris, it's good to see you in the far north, from the far north.
Yeah, Master Jonah, you as well.
Yeah.
How are things going down there?
Thank God. Thank God. We're trying to keep it all together.
Yeah. I don't know. Same here.
So who's going to read for us?
Well, I'm happy to volunteer a few paragraphs.
Okay.
You might get sick of my voice, then somebody else can take over.
Yeah, I can take over after that.
Okay. Well, let's get started.
I'm not recording you, Kirill, because you're not showing. So is that okay?
No, we need to have the recording.
Okay,
yes.
well, can you hear my voice okay? Is my voice showing up?
Yes,
so
yes.
Peter, it will record the audio. Kirill, if you have video, it makes for a more interesting thing.
Oh, well, I'd have to restart Zoom then. Do you want me to do that?
The alternative, Peter, is you could just leave it on Vladika.
Yeah, I could try putting the camera on you, Kirill. Would that? No,
No,
I'd have to restart Zoom to
video
give the
is
thing
not-
permission to use my camera.
What would you like to do, Vladika?
Well, actually, look at there's a little arrow next to the camera at the bottom of the screen. Does that do anything? It has video settings.
Kirill, this would be you enabling your video.
Right. Okay.
And you should not have to relaunch Zoom to enable your video.
Yeah, no, I have to relaunch it, but it'll just take me a minute. I'll just do that anyway, because sometimes it's faster to do something than to talk about it. Hold on.
So I can start reading if that helps.
Okay.
Okay. Everybody ready?
Yeah.
Peter, are you recording?
I am recording. Yeah.
Okay, here we go. On expert discernment. As the heart preached by the heart longs for the stream, so monks long for a grasp of good and divine will, and not only that, but also for what is not the pure will of God, and even for what is opposed to it. This is subject that it is extremely important for us and not easily explained, namely, which of our affairs should be done at once without delay, and as soon as possible, according to him who said, "Woe to him who puts off from day to day, and from time to time, and again, what should be done with moderation and circumspection, as is advised by him who said, War is a matter for guidance, and again, let all things be done decently and in order. For it is not for everyone to decide quickly and precisely such fine points. Even the God-bearing David, who had the Holy Spirit speaking within him, prayed for this gift, and sometimes says, Teach me to do thy will, for thou art my God. And sometimes again, Guide me to the truth, and again, make known to me the way I should go, O Lord, for I lift up my soul from all the cares of life and passions and raise it to thee. 111. Those who wish to learn the will of the Lord must first mortify their own will. Then, having prayed to God with faith and honest simplicity, And having asked the fathers or even the brothers with humility of heart, and no thought of doubt, they should accept their advice as from the mouth of God, even if their advice be contrary to their own view, and even if those consulted are not very spiritual. For God is not unjust, and will not lead astray souls whose faith and innocence humbly submit to the advice and judgment of their neighbor. Even if those who were asked were brute beasts, yet he who speaks is the immaterial and invisible one. Those who allow themselves to be guided by this rule without having any doubts are filled with great humility. For if someone expounded his problems on a harp, how much better, do you think, can a rational mind and a reasonable soul teach them an inanimate object? 112. On account of self-will, many have not accepted the perfect and easy blessing mentioned above. And having tried to discover what was pleasing to the Lord of themselves and in themselves, have handed on to us many various judgments concerning the matter. 113. Some of those who were seeking the will of God laid aside the attachments they submitted to the Lord, their own thought about this or that inclination of the soul. I mean, whether to perform an action or to resist it. They submitted their mind, stripped of its own will, to Him, offering fervent prayer for a set number of days. In this way, they attained a knowledge of His will, either through the spiritual mind spiritually communicating with their mind, or through the complete disappearance from their soul of their cherished intention. 114. Others, on account of the trouble and distractions which attended their undertaking, concluded that these disturbances came from God, according to Him who said, "We wanted to come to you time and again, but Satan hindered us." 115. Others, on the contrary, recognized that their action was pleasing to God from its unexpected success, declaring, "God cooperates with everyone who deliberately chooses to do good." 116. He who has obtained God within him through illumination, both in actions requiring haste and in actions allowing of delay, is assured of his own will by the second way, only without a definite period of time. 117. To waver in one's judgments and to remain in doubt for a long time without assurance is a sign of an unenlightened and ambitious soul. 118. God is not unjust and does not close the door against those who knock with humility. 119. In all our actions, the intention must be sought from the Lord, whether in those who require haste or in those who require to be postponed. For all actions free from attachment and from all impurity will be imputed to us for good if they have been done especially for the Lord's sake and not for anyone else, even though these deeds are not entirely good. 120. Seeking for what is beyond us has no safe end. The Lord's judgment about us is unfathomable. By His special providence, He often chooses to hide His will from us, knowing that, even if we were to learn it, we should disobey it, and should thereby receive greater punishment. 121. An honest heart is free from the different kinds of distractions which occur, and is safely sailing in the bark of innocence. 122. There are courageous souls who, with love and humility of heart, throw themselves into tasks that are beyond them, and there are proud hearts who do the same. For our foes often intentionally suggest to us things beyond our powers, so that these should cause us to lose heart and leave even what is within our power and make ourselves a great laughingstock to our enemies. 123. I have seen those who were sick in soul and body, who, because of the multitude of their sins, engaged in battles that were beyond them and which they could not continue. I say to such as these that God judges our repentance not by our labors, but by our humility. 124. Sometimes upbringing in the cause of great evils, and sometimes company, but often a warped soul is of itself sufficient for its ruin. For who is clear of the first two is free from the third as well. But whoever has the third defect is reprobate everywhere, for there is no place safer than heaven. 125. In the case of those who are malevolently dispute with us, whether unbelievers or heretics, we should desist after we twice admonish them. But in the case of those who wish to learn the truth, let us never grow weary in well-doing. However, we should use both opportunities for the establishment of our own heart. 126. The man who despairs of himself when he hears of the supernatural virtues of the saints is most unreasonable. On the contrary, they teach you supremely one or two things. Either they rouse you to emulation by their holy courage, where they lead you by way of the thrice holy humility to deep self-contempt and realization of your inherent weaknesses. 127. Amongst the impure evil demons, there are some more evil than others. They suggest to us that we should not commit sin alone, but they counsel us to have others as companions in evil, in order to make our punishment more severe. I have seen one learning a bad habit from another, and although he who taught came to his senses and began to repent and gave up doing wrong, his repentance was ineffectual on account of the influence of his pupil. 128. Stupendous, truly stupendous and incomprehensible is the wickedness of the evil spirits. It is not seen by many, and I think that those few who see it only in part. Thus, how is it that while living in luxury and plenty, we keep vigil and do not sleep, and while fasting and exhausting ourselves with labors, are we pitifully overpowered by drowsiness? Or why does our heart become hard while abiding in silence? And why, while sitting amongst the companions, do we come to compunction? When we are hungry, why are we tempted by dreams? Yet when sated, we do not experience these temptations. In poverty, we become dark and incapable of compunction. But if we drink wine, we are happy and easily come to compunction. He who can do so in the Lord, let him bring light to the unenlightened in this matter. If we were not enlightened about this, at least we can say that such a change does not always come from the demons. And this sometimes happens to me, I know not how, by reason of the constitution I have been given, and the sordid and greedy corpulence for which I am girt about. 129. With regard to the changes enumerated above, so hard to interpret, let us sincerely and humbly pray to the Lord. And if after prayer and the time it took, we still feel the same thing at work in us, then let us conclude that this is caused not by demons but by nature. Yet as often pleases divine providence to benefit us through adversity and to check out our conceit by all possible means. 130. It is dangerous to be inquisitive about the depth of divine judgments, because the inquisitive sail in the ship of conceit. 131. Someone asked one of those who could see, why does God, who foresees their falls, adorn some with gifts and wonder-working powers? And he replied, in order to make the spiritual men more careful and to demonstrate the freedom of the will, and to cause those who fall to be without any excuse at the last judgment. 132. The law, being imperfect, says, attend to yourself, but the Lord, being entirely perfect, enjoined upon us the correction of our brother, saying, if thy brother sin against thee, and so on. If you reprimand, or rather your reminder, is pure and humble, you should not refuse to carry out the Lord's behest, and especially in the case of those who accept correction. But if you have not yet got as far as this, then at least practice the precept laid down by the law. 133. Do not be surprised when you see that those whom you love turn against you on account of your rebukes. Frivolous people are the tools of the demons, and especially against the demons' foes. 134. One thing about us astonishes me very much. Why do we so quickly and easily incline to the passions when we have Almighty God, angels, and saints to help us towards the virtues, and only the wicked demon against us? I do not wish to speak about this in more detail. In fact, I cannot. 135. If all created substances keep to their nature, then why, as the great Gregory says, am I the image of God compounded with clay? If some of God's creatures have somehow lost their created nature, it is certain that they will continually strive to return to their original state. Man ought to use every means to raise his clay, so to speak, and seat it at the throne of God. And let no one make excuses for not undertaking this ascent, because the way of the door are open. 136. It excites the mind and the soul to emulation to hear the spiritual feasts of the fathers, and their zealous admirers are led to imitate them through this listening to their teaching. 137. Discernment is a light in darkness, the return of wanderers to the way, the elimination of those whose sight is dim. A discerning man finds health and destroys sickness. 138. All who show surprise at every trifle do so for two reasons, either from crass ignorance, or else they magnify and exalt the deeds of their neighbor with a view to humility. 139. Let us make an effort not only to wrestle with the demons, but also to wage war on them. The former sometimes throws them and is sometimes thrown, but the latter is continuously hounding the foe. 140.
Okay, let's see. I'll stop you right for the moment. Are there any questions?
I have a number. Okay. So right at the beginning, about asking your brother for advice,
Mm-hmm.
That sounds quite dangerous sometimes.
It is.
It's because of my lack of faith, I think. But I guess it's with if we have prayed about it sincerely.
Well, we hope and we hope and pray that God will speak through that person. So, you know, I don't think we can, you know, and if we have faith that God will speak through that person, I think we'll find something there useful. But if we don't, I mean, what are we doing?
Right. So we have to prepare ourselves correctly first.
Right. Yeah. And so he makes the point, I don't remember, that even if they were brute beasts who were asked, still God can speak through them. In a sense, it's to summarize it, it's essentially God is responding to the act of humility of asking someone else for guidance.
Mm. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
It's hard though, right? That's easier said than done. That's vastly easier said than done.
To ask somebody for guidance?
No, to take advice from, I don't know, let's say take advice from someone non-Orthodox, or take advice from, you know, like the guy that I know I know he's what he is. He's this way, he's that way. And to have him say a thing to me, and maybe that's just the human nature. Maybe that's just my own faults or my own failings, that to have somebody else tell me, who I know is walking not the way or the path that I'm walking, to tell me to fix myself, that would be hard to take in.
Uh-huh.
If I'm being honest, to be able to hear it and really take it in. Yeah, because I guess my first thought would be, well, who are you to tell me?
Uh-huh. Yeah, exactly.
It's hard. It's hard. Yeah.
So it talks about the brotherhood there, Vladika. Is this in the context of a monastery that he's talking about, or even in the world? Could you go up to someone if you'd prayed sincerely about it? To whom would you go? Is he really implying you could go to anyone almost and ask them?
Well, I mean that. No, he's addressing a monastic context specifically. In the world, who would we go to? We'd go to our friend, you know, somebody that we know, somebody that we trust, and a colleague, you know, we know and trust. We wouldn't just go up to anybody.
Vladika, Lori, my rule of thumb has been ask more than one person. If you get the same answer, then you can really contemplate whether that's the right thing or not. If you get different answers, then you're really in trouble.
Uh-huh. Yeah, that's true.
I also had a question about 119, Vladika. So that was a very interesting item to me, and it sounds as though he's saying, is he sort of potentially implying that sometimes there are certain situations where you can't necessarily do the right thing no matter what you do, but if you've, there might be certain situations where there's no ideal option. Is he saying that if you've determined to do the will of God the best you can in that situation, that sort of go ahead? Is that the point of that 119, or?
Yeah.
Because right at the end he said, even though these deeds are not entirely good, in all our actions, the intention must be sought from the Lord, whether in those that require haste or in those that require to be postponed. For all actions free from attachment and from all impurity will be imputed to us as good, if they are done especially for the Lord's sake and not for anyone else, even though these deeds are not entirely good.
Well, I think it basically means that if we do something for the Lord's sake, it will be imputed to us for good. In other words, it's an unselfish action, essentially. And even if it's not the best, it's still an unselfish thing. And so it comes out of self-denial instead of out of selfishness. So
I was somehow thinking of those situations where maybe someone was put under oath or somehow they were asked a question and they knew that if they answered correctly, they would cause a great harm to another individual. Would that be, you hear about those sort of things during the war and etc. Was I on the right track there, or?
Well, I think that's I think you're on the right track.
Okay.
Or even if you give money to a beggar for the Lord's sake, and he goes around and buys a drink with it, your intention was right. You did it unselfishly.
Okay.
You did it for the Lord. Didn't quite turn out like you'd hoped, but it was still good. You're not just enabling the person,
Ludika, I have a question about 120. The second or the third sentence, by his special providence, he often chooses to hide his will from us, knowing that even if we were to learn it, we should disobey it and thereby receive greater punishment. Is providence in the sense that it's been spoken of here about God's will for our salvation?
Yes.
Okay. And is that generally how to read providence in Orthodoxy?
Well, it's his will for our salvation, and that everything comes to us from that providence, his will for our salvation. Whether it's good or whether we like it or whether we don't like it, whether it's pleasant or whether it's painful, it's God's providence that we need, is what we need for our salvation. But in that context, so it's out of his love for us, and desire for our salvation, he hides his will from us so that we don't disobey it. Well, I can understand that. So I don't know what else to say. So anybody else? Any other questions at this point? Okay. Pick up with 140, I think.
Sure.
Kirill, did you want to have a turn at reading, or does it?
So we're starting at 140.
Yep.
He who has conquered the passions wounds the demons. By pretending that he still has passions, he deceives his foes and remains unassailable. One of the brethren once suffered disgrace, and without being in the least moved in his heart, he prayed in his mind. Then he began to bewail the disgrace, hiding his dispassion by passion. Another of the brethren, who had no longings at all for the office of superior, pretended that he was working for this. And how am I to describe the chastity of that man who went into a brothel ostensibly for the sake of sin, but drew the harlot to the ascetic life? Again, a bunch of grapes was brought very early in the morning to one of the hermits. And after the person who brought them had gone, he ate them with a semblance of gobbling, but without any pleasure, to make it seem to the demons that he was a glutton. Another, having lost a few palm leaves, spent all day pretending that he was grieved about this. Such people need to take care, otherwise, in trying to fool the demons, they may end by being fooled themselves. It was of these, no doubt, that the apostle said, as deceivers and yet true. 141. He who wishes to present his body pure to Christ and to show him a clean heart must carefully preserve chastity and freedom from anger, for without these our labor is quite useless. 142. Just as eyes have different colored lights in them, so in the soul many different overshadowings of the spiritual sun occur. One kind comes through bodily tears, another through the tears of the soul, one kind through what is contemplated by the bodily eyes, another through the spiritual. One kind comes from hearing words, another is the joy that spontaneously springs up in the soul, although there is one kind that comes from silence, and another which by rapture ineffably and unexpectedly transports the mind in spiritual light to Christ. 143. There are virtues, and there are mothers of virtues. So a wise man strives rather to obtain the latter. The teacher of the mother virtues is God himself through his own action, while there are plenty of teachers for the daughter virtues. 144. Let us beware lest we compensate austerity in taking food by excess of sleep, and vice versa, for such behavior is characteristic of foolish men. 145. I have seen toilers who, for some reason, slightly indulged their stomachs. But soon after this, these courageous ascetics chastised their poor stomachs by standing throughout the night, and in this way they taught them to be well content to refrain from satiety, or satiety, as some pronounce it. 146. The demon of avarice strives fiercely against those who possess nothing, and when it cannot vanquish them, it reminds them of the state of the poor, and persuades those who are spiritual to become material again. 147. In times of despondency, never fail to bear in mind the Lord's commandment to Peter to forgive a person who sins 70 times 7. For he who gave this command to another will himself do far more. But when we are exalted, let us again remember the saying, He who shall keep the whole spiritual law, and yet stumble in one passion, that is, fall into pride, has become guilty of all. 148. There exist certain dispositions of wicked and envious spirits, which voluntarily leave the saints, so as to deprive those who battle any chance of obtaining crowns for victory over them. 149. Blessed are the peacemakers. No one will deny this, but I have also seen enemy makers who are blessed. A certain two developed impure affection for one another. But one of the discerning fathers, a most experienced man, was the means whereby they came to hate each other, by setting one against the other, telling each that he was being slandered by the other. And this wise man, by human roguery, succeeded in parrying the devil's malice, and in producing hatred by which the impure affection was dissolved. 150. Some set aside one commandment for the sake of another commandment. I have seen young men who were attached to one another in a right spirit, yet in order not to offend other men's consciences, by mutual agreement they kept apart for a time. 151. Just as a marriage and a funeral are the very opposite of each other, so too are pride and despair. But as a result of the confusion caused by demons, it is possible to see the two together. 152. At the beginning of the monastic life, some of the unclean demons instruct us in the interpretation of the divine scriptures. And they are particularly fond of behaving in this way, in the case of vainglorious people, and of those who have been educated in secular studies, so that by gradually deceiving them, they may lead them into heresy and blasphemy. We can recognize this diabolical divinity, or rather devilry, by the disturbances and the confused and unholy joy which are felt in the soul during the instruction. 153. All creatures have received from the Creator their order of being and their beginning, and some their end too. But the end of virtue is infinite. For the psalmist says, I have seen the end of all perfection, but thy commandment is exceedingly broad and boundless. If some good ascetics pass from the strength of action to the strength of contemplation, and if love never ceases, and if the Lord will guard the coming in of your fear and the going out of your love, then from this it follows that there is actually no limit to love. We shall never cease to advance in it, either in the present or in the future life, continually adding light to light. And however strange what I have said may seem to many, nevertheless, it shall be said. According to the testimonies we have given, I would say, Blessed Father, even the spiritual beings, that is, the angels, do not lack progress. On the contrary, they ever add glory to glory and knowledge to knowledge. Stop there?
You can keep going, unless
Alrighty.
you have questions.
Oh.
Ladika, this is Herman.
Hello.
Hello. Would you be able to say a few thoughts on 150? I lost it now. Never mind. I'll have to find it again. My apologies. There's the one. It was 151. Sorry. With the duality between pride and despair.
Uh-huh.
Would you be able to perhaps help me understand that a little bit better?
Well, I mean, he makes the analogy between a marriage and a funeral. And although pride and despair are different passions, pride is one and despair is you know, kind of the ultimate form of despondency. I think you can see that in people that pride is often a kind of a false pride, and a self exaltation is a kind of a defense mechanism against despair. People will come out who are in despair will sometimes, you know, say very arrogant and selfish, conceited things, and come off in a very arrogant way, but they're just trying to deflect the recognition of their despair. Does that make sense?
Yes, very much so. Thank you.
Yeah, I'll jump in if nobody's got any questions. Master, can you talk a bit about 149? So I'm reading this, and I assume this was with respect to homosexuality, perhaps in a monastic setting.
Mm-hmm.
So would you say that, so when I'm reading this, I'm thinking, one, the way that he's telling each other to stand up by other people. So by slandering each other, he's getting them to separate. And that seems wrong, but maybe if it's, I don't know, if it's in a monastic setting, or if it's to such a degree that something like that is necessary, perhaps it's like a necessary evil. Is that how to think of it?
It's kind of a necessary evil. I mean, obviously you don't want people to hate one another, but if they're involved in an inappropriate way, then you need to pull them apart. And the only way that's going to happen is if they're, you know, if they've lost trust in one another. So it's a little on the cold side, but you have to do that.
And they've all agreed to be in that environment where there's someone whose role it is to oversee their spiritual development, more so than in a parish setting. So
exactly,
they've opened themselves up to that kind of growth, you know, of giving somebody a chance to help them.
Yeah, exactly.
I had a tiny question about the monastic setting. It goes back to item 141. He who wishes to present his body pure to Christ and show him a clean heart must carefully preserve chastity and freedom from anger, for without these our labor is quite useless. I've heard you, Vladika, commenting that in the monastic setting, one of the largest sort of spiritual problems is anger.
Right.
And so I was wondering if you would just like to narrate that item with your experience and sort of flesh it out for us a little bit.
Well, in a sense, the two things that defile us the most are unchastity and anger. You know, unchastity, of course, defiles the body, but anger really defiles the soul, and makes it and it becomes an obstacle even to well, I won't say to the presence of God, but it becomes an obstacle to perceive the presence of God, because you're so wrapped up in your own anger that, you know, and indeed the fathers say that the Holy Spirit can't coexist in an angry heart. So basically, one of the things that you find in very often in the monastic life is, you know, and people think that the vow of chastity is the hardest. It's not. Most men, you get them away from women, and they're pretty much at peace, you know. But when it comes to anger, a lot of people have a lot of buried anger, resentment, hatred, bitterness, all of these things, some of which have been there for decades, ever since they were children. And in the monastic life, when a person begins to actually engage in spiritual discipline, all of this stuff comes up to the surface, and you start reacting to it. And so part of the whole process of the first few years of monastic life is this purification of the soul to get rid of this anger and this bitterness, and it does work. It can happen, but you have to engage it. And of course, there are plenty of people who become who accept the monastic life and who don't engage it, and so they stay nasty and bitter and angry all their lives. And there's, and they may be outwardly very pious, but inwardly they're just, raging. And so this is not a healthy thing, to say the least. So, but truly, it's that kind of anger, especially resentment, just defiles the soul.
Fascinating. Yeah.
Ludika, how does one engage anger in that type of a setting when you use the term engage?
You basically what you do is you look at your resentments, and you look at the roots of those resentments, and you go through and you look at all the relationships you've had in your life, and how those and what happened with those, and there are points where there are points of anger or points of hurt, and which turns into anger, which turns into judgment, which turns into bitterness, which turns into resentment, and so forth. And you have to go through and forgive, and forgive the people that offended and abused you. And if you can do that, then you'll free yourself from the anger. But otherwise, you'll never free yourself from the anger. We have to be willing to forgive. And the more that we can do that, the more that we can purify our soul from this defilement.
I always find that my own anger is connected back to an excessive concern with myself, and so I wonder if your experience of monks in their first few years, if their sensation of anger is maybe an expression of an internal debate, like, do I really want to do this? Maybe I should do something else, and then things get exaggerated in their mind. It's a concern with self. Is that a role? Is that something?
Very often. But usually anger is produced by hurt. There's anger on one hand, but then there's a kind of a testiness, or being in kind of in a bad mood, which isn't necessarily anger so much. It's actually more related to despondency. I mean, there is that, but for the most part, there's no, in the monastic life, in a healthy community, there's no forcing of any kind of decision. I mean, people are given as long as they need to make a decision. So.
Yeah. I see what you mean. Yeah.
Yeah, it's not like there's pressure. Okay.
If anyone is going to keep reading, we left off at 154. That's next.
Okay, who's next?
I'll read.
Okay.
Astonished that the demons often suggest to us good thoughts and intellectual arguments against them. The aim of our foes in this case is to make us believe that they also know the thoughts of our hearts. Do not judge too severely those who are eloquent in preaching but do not support this in practice. where the profit of a word is often compensated for the dearth of deeds. We do not all obtain everything in equal measure. With some, speech takes precedence over action, but with others, the latter transcends the former. God is not the cause or the creator of evil, and those who say that certain passions are natural to the soul have been deceived, not knowing that we have turned the constituent qualities of nature into passions. For instance, nature gives us the seed for childbearing. We have perverted this for fornication. Nature provides us with the means of showing anger against the serpent. We have used this against our neighbor. Nature inspires us to be zealous for the virtues. We are zealous in evil. It is natural for the soul to desire glory, but the glory on high. It is natural to be arrogant, but against the demons. Joy is also natural to us, but a joy on account of the Lord and the welfare of our neighbor. Nature has also given us resentment, but to be used against the enemies of the soul. We have received the desire for pleasure, but not for profligacy. An energetic soul rouses the demons against itself, but as our conflicts increase, so do our crowns. He who has never been struck by the enemy will certainly not be crowned. But the warrior who does not flinch despite his incidental falls will be glorified by the angels as a champion. He who spent 3 nights in the earth returned to life forever, and he who has conquered 3 hours will never die. If after his rising in us, for the sake of providential chastisement, the sun knoweth his going down, in any case he made darkness his hiding place, and there was the night wherein fierce young lions, which had previously departed, shall go abroad in pursuit of us, and wherein are all the beasts of the forest of thorny passions, roaring to snatch away the hope that is in us, and seeking from God their food of passions, either in thought or in action. And again, through the darkness of humility, the sun rises upon us, and the wild beasts are gathered together, and they lay them down in their dens, that is to say, in sensual hearts, but not in us. Then the demons say amongst themselves, the Lord hath done great things unto them. And we say to them, the Lord hath done great things among us, and we are become glad that you are banished. Behold, the Lord rides on a swift cloud. No doubt the soul that is raised above all earthly desire, and comes into Egypt, into the heart already darkened, and will shatter the idols of man's making, and the deliberations of the mind. If Christ, although omnipotent, as man fled bodily from Herod, let the rash learn not to hurl themselves into temptations. For it is said, in Psalm 120, give not thy foot unto moving, and may the angel that guardeth thee not slumber. Vanity or conceit twines itself round courage, just as blindweed twines round cypress. Let us constantly guard against admitting even the mere thought that we have attained any good whatsoever. Let us keep on looking carefully to see whether this is one of our characteristics. If it is, then we shall know that we have utterly failed. I've utterly failed. Look unceasingly for evidence of the passions, and then you will find many of them in which we are unable to distinguish in our diseased condition, by reason of our own weakness or because they are so deeply rooted. God judges our intention, but in that which is within our power, he, in man befriending wise, also requires us to act. Great is he who leaves undone nothing that is within his power, but greater is he who humbly attempts what is beyond his power. The demons often hinder us from carrying through what is easy and profitable for us, and they urge us to turn to what is more laborious instead. I find that Joseph is blessed for avoiding the occasion of sin, and not for showing dispassion. It may be asked, from what and from how many sins does aversion merit a crown? For it is one thing to turn away from the shadow, but it is a much greater thing to run towards the sun of righteousness. Being in darkness is a cause of stumbling. Stumbling is a cause of a fall, and a fall is a cause of death. Those who have been overcome by wine often wash with water, but those who have been darkened by passions wash with tears. Clouding is one thing, darkness is another, and blindness another. The first is cured by temperance, the second by stillness, and the third by obedience and by God, who for our sakes became obedient. By means of two examples of places in which mundane things are cleaned, we can conceive of the two purifications of those who set their mind on things above. The community, such as is pleasing to God, is like the laundry in which uncleanness, grossness, and deformity of soul are scoured out, and the dye works will be the solitary life for those who have already laid aside dust, remembrance of wrongs and anger, and who are now passing from the monastery to stillness. Some say that we fall into the same sins because we have been unable to correct our former sins through the inadequacy of our repentance. But it may be asked, have all those who have not fallen into the same kind of sin really repented as they should? Some fall into the same sins either because they have sunk into a deep forgetfulness of their former sins, or because they imagine in their own pleasure-loving way that God is merciful, or they have lost all hope of their own salvation. I do not know whether anyone will blame me if I say that their trouble arises because they have not been strong enough to bind the foe who is dominating them through the tyranny of habit. We should inquire why the soul, which is incorporeal, does not see of what nature the spirits are that take up their abode with it. Is it not a result of its union with the flesh? This is known only to him who joined them. A discerning man once asked me, tell me, for I desire to know which of the spirits are liable to cast down the mind when we sin and which of them to lift it up. But I was embarrassed by the question, and on oath I affirmed my ignorance. Then he who wished to learn taught me himself, saying, I shall give you in a few words the leaven of discernment, and then I shall leave you to seek the rest by your own industry. The spirit of lust, the spirit of anger, the spirit of gluttony, the spirit of despondency, the spirit of sleepiness have no tendency to lift up the horn of the mind. But the spirit of love of money, ambition, talkativeness, and many others add evil to evil. This is why the spirit of criticism is near to the latter. If any monk has spent an hour a day in visiting people in the world, or has had them as guests, he ought to rejoice when he parts from them like someone who has been freed from a hindrance and a trap. But if on the contrary he feels the dart of sorrow, this indicates that he has become the toy either of vainglory or of lust. We ought to begin by seeing which way the wind is blowing, then we shall not set our sails against it. Comfort with love, and allow a little respite to old men practiced in charity, such as have exhausted their bodies in asceticism, but compel young men who have exhausted their souls with sins to be abstinent, and bring to their memory the eternal torments. It is quite impossible, as I said in another place, suddenly to become perfectly free from gluttony and vainglory at the outset of the monastic life. We should not fight vainglory with luxury, simply because victory over gluttony, in beginners, gives rise to vainglory. Rather, let us master it by frugality. For the hour will come, and is already here for those who desire it, when the Lord will also subdue this passion under our feet. When they enter monastic life, the young and the aged are not afflicted by the same passions, because they often have quite opposite infirmities. Therefore, blessed, truly blessed is humility, because it makes repentance safe and effective for young and old alike. Do not clamor at what I am going to say. There are indeed true and upright souls, though they are rare, who are strangers to guile, hypocrisy, and mischief, from living with men is completely uncongenial. But with the help of their guide, from stillness as from a harbor, they can ascend to heaven without desiring or experiencing the disturbances and stumbling blocks of community life. Men can cure the lustful, angels the guileful, but only God the proud.
Okay, can we stop here?
No, sorry.
Okay. Couple questions came in. I think one is about 157. Oops. This thing drives me nuts sometimes. Okay. 157 and 171. 157. An energetic soul rouses the demons against itself, but as our conflicts increase, so do our crowns. But he who has never been struck by the enemy will certainly not be crowned. But the warrior who does not flinch despite his incidental falls will be glorified by the angels as a champion. In other words, if we zealously engage the spiritual warfare, it's we can expect that the demons will engage back against us, and that and so that their resistance to us will increase. But if we live in a way where we seem to have no battles at all, we're likely deluding ourselves, and so we will not gain the kind of crowns as if we'd fought against the demons. Says then, but the warrior who does not flinch despite his incidental falls will be glorified by the angels as a champion. In other words, if we continue in our striving and despite the despite however many times we fall, but in other words, get struck by the demons, but we keep going and we don't lose heart, then we certainly will be glorified by the angels as champions. In other words, we'll receive the reward of our striving. Does that make sense? Somebody? Anybody? Then 171. Some say that we fall into the same sins because we have been unable to correct our former sins through the inadequacy of our repentance. In other words, habitual sins. But it may be asked, have all those who have not fallen into the same kind of sin really repented as they should? Some fall into the same sins either because they have sunk into a deep forgetfulness of their former sins, or because they imagine in their own pleasure-loving way that God is merciful, or they have lost all hope of their salvation. I do not know whether anyone will blame me if I say that their trouble arises because they have not been strong enough to bind the foe who is dominating them through the tyranny of habit.
Is it the despair aspect that's the problem? Because I can see falling again and again, but man, so long as you're getting up and trying.
Yeah.
That's.
I think there's that.
Yeah.
He also says there's the remembrance or the imagination of God's mercifulness, or that they've basically given up and lost hope. But what he ultimately says is he thinks that the trouble arises because people aren't strong enough to bind the enemy, and so they keep falling, which is, I think there's a lot of wisdom there.
So he thinks that habitual sins are inevitable?
Well, I don't know that you could say, well, you could almost say inevitable. Because if we're not strong enough to oppose the urge to sin, then we're going to fall. On the other hand, it's not that we haven't repented enough. It's not that we are just thinking, well, God will be merciful to me, and it's not that we've necessarily given up. We're just not there yet. We're just not spiritually we haven't grown to that point of spiritual maturity in which we're able to banish those demons, or to shut off the thoughts.
So there's hope.
Yes, so there's hope.
There's always hope. Always hope.
Yeah. So, more questions?
Ladika, can you explain 159? I was quite confused about 159.
Oh, it's long. If after his rising sun, after his rising in us, for the sake of providential chastisement, the sun knows his going down, in any case, he made darkness his hiding place. And there was the night wherein fierce young lions, which had previously departed, shall go abroad in pursuit of us, and wherein all the beasts of the forest of thorny passions. He's taking, the scriptural passage and making it an extended metaphor. I mean, this is Byzantine rhetoric at its best. He made darkness his hiding place, and there was the night wherein fierce young lions, which had previously departed, shall go abroad in pursuit of us, and wherein all the beasts of the forest of thorny passions, roaring to snatch away the hope that is in us, and seeking from God their food of passions, either in thought or in action. And again, through the darkness of humility, the sun rises upon us, and the wild beasts are gathered together, and they lay them down in their dens, that is to say, in sensual hearts, but not in us. Then the demons say among themselves, the Lord has done great things unto them. And we say to them, the Lord has done great things among us, and we are become glad, but you are banished. Behold, the Lord rides on a swift cloud. No doubt the soul that is raised above all earthly desire, and comes to Egypt, into the heart already darkened, and will shatter the idols of men's making and deliberations of the mind. Well, yes, this is confusing. In other words, for the sake of providential chastisement, in other words, in order to shock us into waking up, God hides his grace from us. The sun knows is going down, and there was the night, and so we're subject to the passions, and are pursued by the passions. The lions roaring to snatch away the hope that is in us, and seeking from God their food of passion, either in thought or in action. In other words, either so that we will fall either in thought or in action. And again, through humility, the sun rises up again in our soul. In other words, we gain hope. And the wild beasts are gathered together and lay them down in their dens, that is to say, sensual hearts, but not in us. In other words, the demons go bother somebody else for a while. Then the demons, hold on one second. Then the demons say among themselves, the Lord has done great things unto them. And we say to them, the Lord, and this is reply. Remember, we even use this in the services. The Lord has done great things among us, and we are become glad. But then he adds, but you are banished to the demons. Behold, the Lord rides on a swift cloud. No doubt the soul that is raised above all earthly desire. In other words, when the Lord comes to our soul and our soul is exalted above earthly desire, it's like God coming into the darkness and shatters the idols and the deliberations of the mind, and so that we're exalted to heavenly vision. And that's the best I can make of that, at least on the fly. Laura, you had a question?
Yeah, does this help save us from pride? So he takes his grace from, or allows, or withdraws his grace from us?
Yep.
And so that we can see when the grace is there, but having that grace all the time would lead us to pride?
Well, he doesn't so much withdraw his grace from us, but our perception of our ability.
The perception of his grace.
Yeah.
Okay.
The grace remains. If he were to completely withdraw his grace, we would vanish. Poof.
And that grace would be the uplifted feeling we have, like, say, when we're in church, we feel kind of uplifted. The church is a hospital, it stands us up. And then we walk out of the church and we sin and we fall.
Right. But, it's not just the feeling. The grace is the energy that causes that feeling.
Okay. Thank you.
Uh-huh.
Ladika, I have a question about 180.
Uh-huh.
Men can cure the lustful, angels the malicious, but only God the proud. How should we understand that? And is that actual to something like our prayer life, or?
Well, that's not just about prayer life. That's about the totality of our life. Men can cure the lustful. In other words, getting the two guys who were in an impure relationship to hate each other, and so that by getting them to think that they were gossiping about one another, that's a way of curing lust. Angels the guileful. In other words, it takes spiritual intervention to heal guile. In other words, to heal maliciousness. But only God can cure pride. Pride, because pride is, what is pride? It's a deeply, where we're so deeply kind of obsessed with ourself that we're oblivious to God and to everything else. Of course, God can cut through that, but other people and maybe even angels sometimes can't. So,
thank you.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so let's finish this off here.
Perhaps one aspect of love often consists in letting the neighbor who is a frequent visitor do what he likes. In any case, showing him all our kindness.
In other words, we're on 182.
Sorry.
Yeah.
It may be asked whether good is destroyed by a kind of repentance in the same way as evil, and if so, how and when and to what extent. We must use great discernment in order to know when to take our stand against sin, and in what cases and to what extent to struggle against the food of the passions, and when to withdraw from the fray. For on account of our weakness, we must choose flight, lest we should die. Let us watch and see, for perhaps in season we may void gall by bitterness. Which of the demons uplift us? Which cast us down? Which harden? Which comfort? Which darken? Which pretend to communicate enlightenment to us? Which make us slothful? Which make us cunning? Which make us sad? And which cheerful? We should not be dismayed if we find that we are more passionate at the outset of our monastic life than we were in our life in the world. For we have to remove the causes of sickness, and then health will come to us. The beasts were there in hiding all the time, only they did not show themselves. When by some accident, those who are otherwise approaching perfection are overcome by the demons in a trivial matter, they should at once use every device in their power to wrench this fault out of them again 100 times over. As the winds in calm weather ruffle only the surface of the sea, but at other times they stir the depths as well, so you can imagine to yourself the dark winds of iniquity. For in those enslaved by passions, they shake the actual consciousness of the heart. But in those who have already made progress, they can only ruffle the surface of the mind. That is why the latter soon feel their normal calm, where the heart was left undefiled. It is the privilege of the perfect to know unerringly whether a thought in the soul comes from their own consciousness, or from God, or from God, or from the demons. For the demons do not at first suggest anything that is repugnant. This is indeed a dark problem and hard to solve. The body is enlightened by its two corporeal eyes, but in visual and spiritual discernment, the eyes of the heart are illumined.
Okay. So do we have any questions on these last verses here?
Yes, Vladika 188. Yes, when thoughts come into our mind, often it's difficult to sort out whether this thought or aspiration or ambition is truly something from God or from the demons.
Yep.
How can we reach discernment in this?
It takes lots and lots and lots of practice over many years, and we have to ask God to help us to understand. All we can do is pray about it. There's no other answer, at least that I know. So who was that?
This is David Vladika.
Oh, okay. Yeah, it's not necessarily showing who.
Oh.
Yeah. So, okay.
So, would a demon give you the same thought that God would give you to trap you or fool you?
Sometimes. You know, the demons tend to give thoughts that are a little more flamboyant.
Okay.
You know, but you know, if you're thinking angels and you know, or if you think you have visions of angels and you know, and you've got this movie running in your head about, you know, like you see on TV, that's probably not from God. So, and it's a trap. The fathers tell us to question anything that comes to us like that.
This Protestant, I think I told you about this, Ladika. He considers himself to be a prophet. And he quotes Mark 9 and I think 1 Corinthians 14, where Mark, I may have gotten the chapter wrong there. It's like Jesus says that God will grant anything that is asked of him. In 1 Corinthians, the Apostle Paul says that he wants everybody to be able to prophesy. So he strung these quote lines together to by what I get like to us would be something that's astonishingly arrogant.
Yeah.
I didn't really know what to think about that. I looked into it somewhat, and apparently, like prophesy in that context doesn't mean like just predict the future. It means in modern English. In the 1500s, it meant to preach on a religious subject or like have inspired preaching. There's like an error of interpretation there, but like the whole Pentecostal phenomenon.
The greatest problem with Pentecostal phenomenon is that there's no discernment, and that's usually because you have very spiritually immature people who are incapable of discernment, and so they take any spiritual phenomenon as divine, and a lot of them are demonic. Now there are some very mature people in there, in that movement, and they're usually very sober. They're not the crazy ones who are going off and into all of the nonsense. But according to our tradition, it takes profound ascetic experience of conquering one's passions and getting over selfishness and overcoming selfishness, which is essentially what most of this is saying. That we're unable to, as long as we have any kind of passionate distraction within us, we're not going to be able to hear and to speak forth, which is the word prophecy, to speak forth the will of God, which is really what prophecy is all about. And so, some of these people are just, they're just sincerely deluded. Some of them are very sincere but deluded. Others are pretending. Some, there may be a grain of truth there, but I think as Orthodox Christians, we put absolutely zero trust in that. And even in the Orthodox world, we have, some of these monks from Mount Athos, they use their supposed authority because they're monks on Mount Athos as great, that they're some kind of great prophets of the will of God, and we can't trust that either, because if it's coming from arrogance and pride, and that can be hidden, and it can be counterfeit, then it's still just as much a product of the ego or from the demons as something outrightly sinful. In other words, I tend to use, well, we won't go there. So let us pretend, so anybody?
I could pose a question about 183 if you like. 183, we must use great discernment in order to know when to take our stand against sin. So it contrasts standing against sin versus withdrawal or flight. And I've always thought that withdrawal is our default strategy, because then being more confrontational is sort of risking. Is much more risky, and it's almost like tempting, the fate in oneself. So I was wondering if you could give us a little nuance about what it could mean to take a stand against sin, sort of contextualize that for us.
Well, it doesn't mean to go and march down to go campaign against sin. What it means is to, if you're in a situation of sin, I don't know, say you're in some kind of gathering and you got some woman hitting on you, what's the best thing to do? Is leave. That way you don't fall. You don't tempt yourself. Or even worse, if you're in a party and you're hitting on some woman and you realize it, then the best thing is you better leave. Discretion, in other words, discretion is the better part of valor.
Master, can I just jump in and say something? So my wife and I were having a similar conversation, maybe like a week or so ago, and I forget where. I think we're talking. Some celebrity came up that was cheating on his wife, and so she posed a question to me, saying, if I were, would I do the same if I was in the same circumstance, the same situation? And I said, yeah, well, I would like to think no, but being, I don't know, being around it, having it in your face all the time, being tempted over and over, I don't think it's wrong to say that, yeah, removing myself from that would be the best path forward for me personally. I don't think that, I didn't look at that as a weakness. I looked at that as just a discernment that that's not for me. I'm going to get weak there over time. And she gave a smile and chuckled and said, okay. But I could see some wives or whatever your significant other be, that to take that to mean that you're weak or you might fall, if in a certain context or situation. And I don't know, I'm not sure if that's true or not.
Well, we have to be humble enough to admit our own weakness.
Yeah.
And part of that is self-knowledge.
Yeah.
And that if you suffer from the passion of fornication, you don't go to a whorehouse. If you're a glutton, you don't turn on the Food Channel. It's staying away from situations of sin and having the discretion to know what you can do and the discernment to know what you can do and what you can't.
So in that language, taking a stand against sin is like believing you're strong enough to endure.
Right.
Which you might not be able.
Right. Yeah. So for example, it would be fatal for me to turn on certain news networks. That wouldn't last very long without my getting really angry. Or listening to certain politicians or churchmen. So you have to know where you have to know what your strengths are and what your weaknesses are, and act accordingly.
Ladiga, I wanted to ask a question going back to receiving some sort of whisper or advice from the demons that could be interpreted as being from God. But my question is more specific to the appearance of saints. How does the church teach us to decipher those situations? I'm assuming that it's similar. And then how does the church corporately, how does the church respond to those situations in such an interconnected way today?
Well, one of the things that has not developed in American Orthodoxy is the intensity of how close many traditional Orthodox Christians feel to the saints, especially among the Greeks, for example. It's really amazing. They have this tremendous sense of the immediate proximity of the saints. They'll talk to them, they're just there. We have not developed that. And partly that's because we're so profoundly spiritually immature in reality. And but the more, the older you get and the longer you've been in this, the more of a sense you have of the saints. So I think the main thing is that if you have some kind of lucid dream of a saint or some kind of vision or something, you always, the first thing that you do is you take it to your spiritual father. You take it to confession, and you ask and you submit, is this real or not? Should I put any stock in this? And through that humble act of submission, and it is an act of humility, you leave it to the discernment of the confessor, to tell you whether it's something you should pay attention to or not. But if it's a sense of just of the presence of the saints or something like that, I mean that's just normal actually in Orthodoxy. It's just normal. We're just not there yet for the most part, most of us.
Ladika, would you say that feeling of distant from the saints in American Orthodoxy comes from the standard feeling of Americans, or the thought of Americans thinking that God is out there? He's like way out there and we're here. That distance between God as well.
Yeah. I mean, as Americans, I think we do have that idea of that God is out there someplace, and rather than permeating all of reality. So, and also for the saints.
Right.
Yeah.
I think, Vladika, once I read something, I think it was from a life of St. Isios the Athonite.
Uh-huh.
When he experienced divine visions, he would make the sign of the cross and say the Jesus prayer, and that if it was of demonic influence, it would immediately dispel. If it was real, then the vision would persist.
Yeah.
Yeah, a good idea, like a lucid dream to do that.
Yeah, it would be the same basic principle. The demons don't they flee from the name of Christ and from the Jesus prayer. So
Can any demons actually persist if you make the sign of the cross? I mean, could they have the fortitude to overlook your reference to Christ and Jesus prayer?
well, they keep coming. They keep coming.
And Vladika, is some of that up to God, what he allows?
Yes, it is. It's all God's providence.
Okay.
What do we need for our salvation? Do we need to work through this stuff? How do we need to get over ourselves? So,
Vladika, this is Anatoly.
uh-huh.
I have a quick question. Going back to the topic of fighting sin or fleeing away from it, what if you're in a situation where you are very likely to fall, but you can't get out of that situation, you can't flee? So what would you do? What's the best course of action in that case?
I'm sorry, state that again, please.
Okay, sorry, maybe something's wrong with the audio. So if you are in a situation where you cannot get out of that situation, but you know that you are very likely to fall. So you know you're in a situation that is very likely to result in a fall into sin, but you cannot avoid the situation. what would you do?
Well, you just keep praying. You pray that God will give you the strength to deal with whatever comes.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Well, it's after 9 o'clock. So, does anybody have a final question?
Yes, Vladika, on step 133, it says frivolous people are the tools of the demons, and especially against the demon's foes. Frivolous people seem to me people that try to make a joke out of everything, try to make light out of everything, and I think that's what comedians tend to do, is they push the boundaries against the sacred and to make light of everything. What are your thoughts of these frivolous people?
Well, I think, it's it can be quite irritating. I mean, certainly, that irritation that they produce is certainly, I mean, they certainly are tools of the demons in doing that. But that they're being used against the demon's foes. I don't know what that means. I don't understand that.
Well, speaking from my experience visiting Jordanville, in the trapeza, sitting down for the meal, as pilgrims, we were sitting on the left side with the other pilgrims and the young seminarians, and I noticed that there was a difference between the young seminarians and the monks, the tonsured monks. It seemed to me that the young seminarians, being many of them young men, they tended to be a little more frivolous than the tonsured monks, more inclined to making jokes, not really honoring the silence rule in the trapeza. Would you say that in an indirect way, or perhaps even a direct way, that the demons were sort of causing that behavior?
I think sometimes we give way too much credit to the demons to cause such behavior. If you've got a bunch of boys that are in the seminarians up there, they're going to cause all sorts of consternation to the older monks. It doesn't take demons to provoke them. Okay. The demons can certainly, but the boys are going to be boys. So.
Thank you.
Vladika, some of that's just our own will that we're choosing not, we're choosing not to do this versus that, isn't it?
Right. That's true.
And St. Anthony's, they have a monk that stands up and comes over to you if you talk. So
even the guests?
Even the guest, he'll come over to the guest table. It's often the women's table because some women are chatting. He'll come over and stand behind you, and then everybody shuts up.
No, well.
You mean while they're reading the book?
Right, and the women will whisper. I mean, and it's literally just a whisper. And when they do, he jumps up from his seat over. He's sitting over with the monks. He'll jump up and walk over to exactly the person that's whispering. And then that person will be quiet.
Well, that's good. You know, in some monasteries, the person would be given prostrations.
Oh, really?
Yeah. All right, give me 30 right now.
Ah, interesting.
So, okay, so, all right. So shall we cut the video and we'll say the prayer and then we can, if people want to talk, we can talk, but we'll end the discussion here. Okay? It is truly me to bless thee, O Theotokos, ever blessed and most pure, and the mother of our God, more honorable than the cherubim, more glorious beyond compare than the seraphim. Without corruption thou gavest birth to God the Word. True Theotokos, we magnify thee. The blessing of the Lord be upon you through his grace and love for mankind, always now and ever, and into ages of ages. Amen.
Ispalati despota.
God bless you.